More in the front?
Change topic?
Sure.
Okay. Could we go to Ukraine?
Mm-hmm.
So the NATO chief has come out today and sort of also backed up what you were saying yesterday about more convoys of trucks and so on, and going into eastern Ukraine from Russia. And the Ukrainian defense minister now is warning about there might be possible new fighting, and that they're gearing up their forces for combat operations and preparing their reserves as well. Is there a fear in this building that we're on the brink of some kind of all-out fighting again in Eastern Europe, in Eastern Ukraine?
Well, we've been concerned for months now, as you know, since the beginning of this conflict, about the impact of the illegal actions of Russian-backed separatists and those who are going into cities and towns around Ukraine. I would note, as you noted, General Breedlove, I think who you were referring to, has indicated that NATO has seen the same developments reported by the OSCE, that large military convoys of Russia-supplied heavy weapons and tanks have moved to the front lines of the conflict in recent days. Obviously, our preference would be to see a ceasefire continue.
Mm-hmm.
And what we've seen is ongoing continuous blatant violations of the Minsk Protocol by Russia and its proxies. Now, it remains the case that Ukraine has the right to defend itself and its territory, but certainly the reason we supported the Minsk Protocol is because we wanted to see a peaceful resolution. I'm not going to get ahead of where we are now because, obviously we've seen these reports. I don't have anything new from the U.S. government in terms of confirmation, though we certainly stand by what the OSCE and NATO have said about where the convoys are.
What is the United States actively trying to do to de-escalate the tensions in that region? There was a meeting in Beijing between Secretary Kerry and Foreign Minister Lavrov.
And Secretary Kerry spoke with Foreign Minister Lavrov today as well. They talked about Iran and the P5+1 negotiations, but they also talked about Ukraine and our ongoing concerns about escalating tensions there, the need to abide by the Minsk protocols, and we'll continue to press these issues and discuss with other counterparts in the world what our concerns are.
But is there any move to try and bring the sides together in a negotiation at the moment? I mean, it's all well and good to say that you're concerned about it, but it does seem that there's no diplomatic...
Joe, in the past, the United States hasn't been a party to those. In terms of how it would proceed in the future, obviously, handling things diplomatically is always our preference. I don't have anything to preview for you in terms of the OSCE and what they may or may not be doing or working on, but obviously our objective is to get back to the ceasefire and the agreements made under the Minsk Protocol.
Jen, it seems as though both sides, both the U.S. and Russia, or at least through what you just said about Secretary Kerry and then what the Russians are saying about Foreign Minister Lavrov, you're both saying the Minsk agreements needed to be abided by, and yet you're saying that the Ukrainians are abiding by it and the Russians aren't, while the Russians say the exact opposite. I mean, is there a point to these conversations when they're just talking past each other? You can't even agree on this. You can't agree on the facts.
The challenge with the account of the Russians is that NATO and the OSCE both conveyed that large military convoys of Russian-supplied heavy weapons and tanks have moved to the front lines of the conflict in recent days. That's a clear violation of the Minsk protocols. So we're talking about actions and what's happening on the ground. We certainly agree that the Minsk protocols need to be abided by, but the actions of the Russians and their proxies is not backing up their rhetoric. That's our concern.
But do you think that there's a fundamental misunderstanding by one party or another as to what the Minsk agreements actually call for?
There should certainly not be. We've been pretty clear. They include everything from the release of political prisoners to moving back, military to moving back from the border, and obviously these actions that have been taken are contrary to it. They're very clearly stated out.
But you don't see anything that the Kiev government is doing as being in violation of Minsk. Is that
I'm
right?
not sure what the Russians are referring to. Did they get specific about what they convey as the violation?
I mean, they talk about shelling of civilian buildings in Donetsk and other places in the east. I mean, if the Ukrainians are doing that, isn't that a violation of Minsk?
Well, the Russian-backed separatists, there's been intensified shelling around the Donetsk airport. as well as Debaltseve, where separatists appear intent on moving forces well beyond the lines agreed in Minsk. So again, this is a case where there are Russian-backed separatists aggressively going into land that is owned by Ukraine and is Ukrainian land, and conveying that the Ukrainians can't take steps to defend themselves, and we just don't agree with that.
Okay, but you see no validity at all to Russian arguments that the Ukrainian army is also violating.
Well, I have
Minsk.
not heard any specifics that warrant, that would qualify as a violation.
Did you say anything about the Security Council this afternoon? There's a call for the Security
You're
Council.
right.
to
Samantha
make-
Power, Ambassador Samantha Power will be speaking later this afternoon. I believe the meeting starts around 2:30, so she'll speak shortly after that.
Okay.
Why did you feel the need to call for a Security Council meeting on this? And second, did the Secretary convey to Foreign Minister Lavrov in private what you from the podium and many other U.S. government officials have said publicly, that further Russian violations of the ceasefire agreement would lead to Russia paying and increasing, would raise the cost to Russia of its behavior?
We've definitely conveyed that privately to the Russians, just as we've conveyed that publicly.
Did the Secretary do that? Do you know?
On their recent call, it was certainly expressing our concerns about the situation in Ukraine. I think it's they know what the consequences will be should they proceed down this path. What was your second question?
The other one was why you felt it necessary to call for the Security Council meeting for Ambassador Power to speak on Ukraine.
Well, obviously we're concerned about continuous blatant violations of the Minsk Protocol, and we're certainly concerned about tensions on the ground and reports over the past couple of days about the developments seen by NATO and the OSCE. As you know, there have been meetings in the past, or several over the past several months about this, and I expect Ambassador Power will speak to this in the next hour or so, if I'm doing my time right. Sure. One more in Ukraine? Sure, go ahead.
Sorry, I mean, it just seems like an appropriate day, Jen, given the statements from NATO today and whatnot. Could you remind us a little bit about what these consequences will be? Beyond just saying we don't agree, is there actually something being seriously discussed in this building with regard to perhaps increasing sanctions?
Well, I will say that, one, we continue to work closely with the EU to look at how we can jointly impose more costs on Russia for its unacceptable behavior. We and our allies and partners would be prepared to broaden and deepen existing sanctions. But I would also remind you that because there are so many executive orders or the European versions of that in place, I think Chancellor Merkel referenced the openness to adding people or entities. So that's really what we'd be talking about. I don't have anything further to preview other than to convey that continues to be where we stand, and we'll continue to coordinate and discuss exactly those issues.
Does it feel more likely today than, say, 3 days ago, before there were Russian heavy armor and troops moving across the border, that we might be moving closer to what you just described, adding individuals? Does it seem closer
with every
today?
additional aggressive action, it increases our focus and increases our level of discussion. Go ahead.